All right. Hello, Catholic Patreon, Catholic YouTube, Catholic wherever you may be. My Catholic friends, one and all. Another Friday installment of what shall I call these? Friday musings, Fridays. I don't know. I'll come up with something for it. When I get a chance, and typically it would be on a Friday, I'm going to stop and record. I'm thinking largely this is for my Patreon channel, but of course I'll put it out on YouTube. I've got some people over on Patreon. We got a little thing going over there, and I want to make sure, especially for those of you that are paying, that I'm providing you guys with consistent quality content. Now it's hard. It's hard to do that with the kind of commitment and time that I put into some of the other lectures, whether it's the ones where I've got slides or whether it's my Monday night ones that I do on YouTube and X, where I spend a lot of time making sure my notes are in order and things like that. So I'm thinking these little Friday excursions are going to be more casual. Maybe we'll get into some deep stuff, but it at least needs to be enough that I can, off the cuff, have some things that I am already familiar enough that I can riff on them a little bit. So for today, the topic of discussion is going to be what I consider a very interesting one. It's going to be Father Charles Coughlin. Now, we've done a podcast, a lecture on Father Coughlin, gosh, 2 years ago at this point, I think. I want to take you all, though, down a little trip down memory lane. For my longtime listeners, you guys know I like to do these little trips down memory lane. And I'm, let's see, probably early 20s, forming my political identity, though I had been political since I'm just a little boy. I remember my mom she loves to tell the story where I told her as just a little boy that she'd better not vote for Bill Clinton. I had an intuitive sense that he was not a good man. And so I didn't even know who the other candidate was. I just knew that Clinton was president and he was running for re-election. And I told her she'd better not vote for him. And into my 20s, fast forward into my 20s, and those days, in the pre-internet days, where the internet was around, it just wasn't as useful back then. I call it more like a glorified phone book in the early 2000s. I would read somebody, read a political work, read a historical work or something, and I always had this knack for catching names. If a name was thrown out in a book or something that I heard somewhere, I would make a mental note and then I would go search that person out. And again, this is the days before the internet. So to search a person out back then was harder to do than it is today. I can think of many different characters I found like that. Alexander Hamilton, H.L. Mencken, Samuel Johnson. They're doing if you guys like podcasts, the rest is history. I don't listen to a whole lot of them. They recently did a fairly decent one on St. Joan of Arc, but right now they're running through one on Dr. Samuel Johnson, who I discovered in my early 20s. And yeah, that was an important milestone in my life. Can I think of any others? Yeah, I mean, there was many others, just names that would something I was reading, or I remember when this was a high school assignment. The high school assignment was I had to read Richard Wright's novel called Black Boy. And when I'm reading this novel, there's a time when Richard is in his teens and he discovers, so this is like not clearly something that other people did. It wasn't necessarily unique to me, though I didn't have access to whether or not other people were doing this. But reading this story, it was like, oh, this is a thing that happens. At least it did before the internet. Now you can just Google somebody as soon as you hear a name. But Richard Wright, as a young black boy living in the South, kept hearing the name H.L. Mencken. And the name Mencken in the South was like, you would speak his name in like whispered tones. Oh, did you see that? Don't let the kids hear, or don't let, subversive. Like you didn't want people reading Mencken. So him as a little black boy, he's really not supposed to be reading anyways. And he goes on this hunt to find, he's like, they don't want me to read it. That's what I want to read. So he goes on a hunt to find H.L. Mencken. And I just remember that, like, his account of that captivated me. And it took me like 3, 4, 5 years till I actually got my hands on a Mencken book. I was down at Chop Suey, the used bookstore in Richmond, Virginia. It's probably long gone at this point. Any of you guys remember Chop Suey in the early, like the 90s, 2000s? It was like the famous used bookstore in Richmond, Virginia. There it was, like glowing on the bookshelf after 5 years of looking for Mencken. I found his Prejudices. And yeah, I finally got to read them. But another person that this happened with, that I don't remember specifically what I was reading, like what the book was, but I do remember the context. So I was reading something about the Great Depression. And FDR makes a comment where he says, the three most dangerous people in the United States were General MacArthur, Huey Long, Kingfish down in Louisiana, and somebody named Father Charles Coughlin. I'm like, okay, MacArthur. I know MacArthur. I understand why he would say MacArthur. I know Long. I can see why he would be a little bit concerned about Long. But who is this Coughlin guy? Never heard of him. So I had to go out, and it was very scarce information for me in these early days of searching out for Father Coughlin. Fast forward to, I guess, I try to put these timelines together in my mind from whenever I read that to years later. I'm talking like in my 20s in college. It's 2008, 2009 period. Ron Paul's all the rage in politics. MP3s really start to become popular. And I was downloading like Ron Paul speeches, and I was a libertarian in college. Just downloading Ron Paul speeches, downloading Ayn Rand speeches. I know, super cringe. I didn't go deep into the libertarian thing, but I found it as a young idealist, you can get sucked into that a little bit. And then I remember thinking, gosh, I wonder if there's any of those old Father Coughlin radio broad, because he was a radio priest. He was on the radio in the 1930s. I was like, I wonder if any of his, because I couldn't find any books on him. There's still really not any good books on Father Coughlin. I wonder if I could find any of his old radio broadcasts. Sure enough, I had about 5 or 6 different broadcasts that I downloaded and I would listen to. And I was just like absolutely riveted. It was at the same time that I was really starting to make the political transition. And I will say that despite his mistakes, Ron Paul, for my generation, for those of us that were paying attention, became a vertex between like normie politics and digging deeper into things. Because Ron Paul, when he ran for president, he kept getting asked about his foreign policy. And I knew by then something was off, right? We were several years into the Iraq War. And Ron Paul, when he spoke about, libertarians are pretty good with assessing the problem of our foreign policy. Sometimes their solutions aren't that great, but when assessing the problem, they're actually quite good. They're some of the best, most reliant material that you can find out there. And Ron Paul gave a reading list for his campaign. He said, if you want to understand American foreign policy, read these books. So he gave a reading list. And I went and bought all the books that he put on his reading list. So I was going through, and then it wasn't just like libertarian slop. The reading list was Michael Schorier, it was Chalmers Johnson, it was a few other sources that he had in there as well. And when I'm reading this stuff, and then I'm reading at the same time Pat Buchanan, discovering his work. So I'm really starting to emerge in my own political consciousness at that time. Like it's starting to develop into something that I hold to this very day, almost without very few exceptions, some minor tweaks that I've made along the way in the succeeding, almost 20 years now, since 2008 and 9, that period. And so I'm listening to those Father Coughlin broadcasts, and that was almost all of the window that I had into him. But I could construct around what I knew of the history of FDR, what I knew of the history of the Great Depression and World War II, what was going on. And now it was many years later that I picked up a book called Hate. There's like Radio Priest, something about hate radio, the father of hate radio. It was a major hit piece. That was what I was doing, the book review that I did when I talk about Father Coughlin a couple years ago on this channel. But regardless of the fact that this guy wrote a hit piece on Father Coughlin, it was still some useful information in there that sort of gave context to some of the things in his life. So who was he? Father Coughlin was a priest who came into his own in the 1920s. He's down, or excuse me, rather I guess I'm in Maine now, so he's over in the Detroit area. He's got a little parish there. At one point, actually, the Ku Klux Klan burns his church down, and he stands defiant on the lawn as his church is going up in flames and smoldering ruins. And he says, I will build something that they will never be able to destroy again. And in place of this little church that burnt down, he had constructed the Basilica of the Little Flower, which I recommend you guys all look at. Go do a Google search on it, or if you get to the chance, go visit it. It's an Art Deco cathedral, which is a super fascinating style of art that didn't last very long. It only really lasted through the 1920s, but it's got a very specific look to it. You don't find it there. And then as the Great Depression kind of gets underway, he begins to go to the radio. And he is a very effective and provocative orator, he finds. And he's borderline between sort of pious sermonizing and Catholic social teaching, political activism. And he actually, I think, becomes more potent. He becomes more well known due to his political activism over his specifically like more obviously religious tone, even though the religious is always influenced within what he's speaking about politically. Because, for example, when he was in seminary, when he was in training, he was part of a group called the Basilians. And they had a specific interest, a unique interest in medieval usury laws and how the problem of usury is so damaging to our world today. And so that sort of gave him a leg up when it came time for the Great Depression and assessing some of the problems that he saw. So on November 11th, 1934, we are 5 years at that point into the Great Depression. He comes onto his radio show and he announces that he's going to put out a political platform for a group that he's putting together called the National Union for Social Justice. And basically what this was designed to be was not necessarily a contender against Republicans or Democrats like an independent party. It's more like a pressure group and a think tank that would be designed to apply certain principles that he was promoting on his radio show into political pressure, converted into political pressure, and therefore eventually converted into policy. And the context of all of this is that the Great Depression is run amok at this point. There's millions that are facing unemployment. You remember, you're into 1934 at this point. So you're several years, the Great Depression sinks in, its fangs sink in. 29 was a shock, like the little shock wave. But the cracks in the ground and the crevices start to split and splinter and open up, and everybody starts falling down into it by 34. The bank failures, farms are foreclosing, homes are being repossessed, foreclosed. There's like rampant poverty in the cities, and even out into the rural areas, you have the what do they call it? The Okies, the Dust Bowl people who, when the farms are in the Midwest, God, it was such a horrible time for people to. A lot of people thought it was the end of the world. You look at the images of the Dust Bowl, and you can see why somebody might be inclined to think that. And these Ogies, as they called them, people from Oklahoma, these farmers, their whole life, generations long farmland, just like the dirt just turns into dust and it goes up into the air, and everything, all the arable farmland just disappears. And so those people are now, they're trying to go west into California looking for jobs. Look at Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, for an example, like just a fictional tale of what that was like. So that's where you're at. That's where you're at, 1934. You're also into the Roosevelt administration now. Hoover's gone. Hoover, under whom the banks foreclosed, under whom the unemployment started to skyrocket, and all of these things are happening. Roosevelt comes in. Coughlin is initially fairly on board with Roosevelt. He's, I don't think he ever perfectly aligns as a New Dealer, but he does align himself to some of the basic platitudes that Roosevelt is pushing forth on his agenda. Now, when Roosevelt wins the election, there's almost like an immediate turn on Coughlin as it becomes apparent that Roosevelt's not actually going to move in the direction that he said he was going to move, because immediately Roosevelt starts to cave to the bankers. That's one of the huge things that you're going to find in Father Coughlin's, in his sermons, in his radio programs. And so he's trying to, so the way Coughlin sees it, by 1934, there's two ends of a vast spectrum of economic options that the Americans are faced with at the moment. There's communism, the Bolsheviks, remember 1934, you now have the collectivism of Stalin underway. And Stalin is also, by 1934, exporting the revolution. You have the Spanish Civil War taking place in Spain. So you got communism on one side, and then Coughlin says that you have the bankers on the other side, which he does at this point align heavily with the Jewish bankers, because many of the bankers were Jewish. And so that's the two sides. And then he says, but there's a third way. And this is what he wants to represent with Catholic social teaching, where he says unbridled capitalism on one end and strict collectivist, atheist, revolutionary communism on the other end are like almost like the horseshoe curve, like they come back around and meet each other. And I think that's much closer to reality than what a lot of the people on the right want to admit. Because there's this talk about the religious right. And look, I self-identify almost for the purposes of like expediency when I'm talking with people. Yeah, I lean right, but then I have to begin heavily qualifying what that means. Because when it comes to the right, it's almost, and Ayn Rand saw this, and I'm going to give Ayn Rand the credit for seeing this, that she sees in true capitalism an almost mirror image of communism. And the two things that they share mirrored with each other is that religion is incompatible with them. So Ayn Rand, the atheist that she was, I think was correct that true unfettered capitalism is every bit as atheistic as unfettered communism is. So he comes along with a platform which intentionally and specifically seeks to put in economic reforms, labor reforms, anti-elite reforms that are within the realm of Catholic social teaching. And November 11th, 1934, he takes to the radio and he gives an address. And he lays out his platform for a political party that he would like, we would call them today a political action committee, right? A think tank group to put pressure on politics and politicians, rather. So I'm going to share, because maybe a year ago at this point, let me check. Yeah, it's been a while. Almost a year ago, I posted on X this post where I'm talking about, I say, the platform of Father Charles Coughlin's political goals, how well do they hold up? And I list them all here. And I don't think anybody else has ever done this before. This was a kind of a popular post. And one of the things that I didn't point out in the post is that this actually comes directly from the Radio Priest book that I was talking about, where the guy was, like I said, it was a hit piece. He hates Father Coughlin, but he gives some good information in here about Father Coughlin. And one of the things, and it's in his footnotes, he sources the exact date and the radio program that he lays this out in. So it's fairly well sourced. And yeah, he lays it out. He itemizes it just like this. And so I said, how well does this platform hold up today? And I thought, as soon as I posted this, I didn't really offer a lot of my own feedback. I was engagement farming with this post. But as soon as I posted, I was like, man, I would like to do a live at some point where I go through and discuss some of what's in this platform and maybe take a look and see how well it would hold up for today. Because I think it's not that there's hit and miss. I think it's mostly, I would dare say, mostly hit. But there is some things that are maybe a little bit dated that don't apply so much to us today. So, number one, liberty of conscience and education. I think this applies to us today very much. And basically, what he's saying with this is that religious freedom, especially here in the context of the US, wants to say it's a secular state, secular government, anyways. And so having these sort of monopolies or impositions in place at an institutional level, at a governmental level, that would suppress the ability of self determination for Catholics within the country to educate children, their own children, the way that they would. Among the two fears, primarily for Catholics from the beginning, was fear of Protestants proselytizing their Catholic children, and two, the fear of just general secularism. Now, in the 1920s and 30s, that battle was still underway. Protestants and secularists were arguing with each other. We know with the Scopes Monkey trial, which direction all of that would eventually go. The secularists won in the public school realm, anyways, but the Catholics by that point had really demarcated a place for themselves in the US by forming separate institutions for our own religious education. Absolutely, liberty of conscience, liberty of education. This would be a very Numenian sense of a political platitude that helps us if we can. Now, that doesn't mean to say that those institutions that we formed don't need to be heavily guarded and heavily preserved and protected from, dare I say, foreign influences, either foreign in terms of other political states or foreign in terms of other religions that are seeking to come in and influence them. But 100%, I think one of the unique and most beautiful aspects of American Catholicism was the fact that these bishops and these parents had the foresight to set aside money and to build these schools. And so Father Coughlin, right at the very top there of his political platform, wants to make sure that we maintain that independence for Catholic education and Catholic schools. 100% still, I would say maybe even more so today than it was even in his own day, though it certainly was a problem in his own day. So, a just living wage for all labor. Now, this was a huge problem in going into the Great Depression. This is some overlap, of course, with maybe the New Deal, which I'll talk about at the end here, maybe some of that overlap, but perfectly in line with what I think would be needed today, guaranteeing every able worker the sufficient wages to support a family based on American standards of living. Now, we do have to be reasonable with our American standards of living, and I think that we should be propagandizing more towards, especially more towards spiritual poverty. I think if we were to, you don't have to tell people like, hey, you don't need 5 cars, because then they're going to want to buy 5 cars. But if you religiously educate them, especially in the Franciscan style of humility and poverty, we might be able to bring down some of what that standard is. Because right now, I will wholly admit, one of the arguments against people constantly complaining about the state of the economy today was like one of the arguments that's put forth, especially by like boomers and older people, was, hey, we lived on a lot less back then. And you guys have this outlandish standard that everybody's supposed to be like a little Elon Musk running around. And that's the American standards of living. That's not tenable. I wholly agree with that. I do think there's a lot of delusional young people, but I think we could with enough propaganda, because these delusional young people, they're getting that crap fed to them from Instagram, from the TikTok algorithms. Personally, I would have complete and total control of that by the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and we could solve all of our problems with the society if we were to do that. Be that as it may, a little bit of humility with what the American standards of living are. And then I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask employers in this country to provide sufficient wages to support single, one man should be able to support his family. And when you have an open economy where everybody's vying for the supply versus demand, employer versus employee, then it's all of this bargaining and leveraging, and it's everybody pitted against each other. Where I'm not opposed to a independent third party government. Usually it has to be the government, because they're the only ones that has the force to do it, to step in and say, no, these are the wages, this is what you're going to pay, and worker, this is what you are going to provide the employer. Okay. Nationalization of resources too important to be held by individuals. Now, this is where you start getting into some of the controversial stuff, and it's, do I want to lay my cards out on the table? So the idea here, nationalization, is when the government takes over certain private properties. And so what he's thinking about here, he's thinking about specifically in the context of the Great Depression. You have the banks, which are doing shady things. You have utility companies doing shady things, oil companies, gas, all of these natural resources. They are oftentimes just simply profiting at the expense of the public during the Great Depression and these times when people are living in scarce conditions, and the corporate sector is failing. It's failing to provide, but yet somehow these people are still profiting while everyone else is having to make huge, massive shifts and changes to their lives. So he's saying we need to have the government step in here, nationalize private industry, at least some sectors of it, which make society function. And hey, I'm actually not too opposed to public private overlap in these senses, because I do think that companies are going to look out for the interest of the companies. And it's not in the interest of the people to be at war with the companies, because the companies aren't having pressure on them to do the right thing. The companies need to, and by the right thing, the thing that's going to stabilize society, because everybody loses when society becomes unstable. The people lose, the corporations lose, and the government loses. Everybody loses during instability. So we need somebody to come in and stabilize these things during times of instability. If you leave them to their own, they're not going to make they're going to make very selfish choices. They're not going to make objective choices, which would, hey, we can't have entire swaths of the population unable to heat their homes or unable to get food and produce to the grocery stores, where people are going to start starving. We can't have that, so that you can eke out your profits, your profit margins. Like sometimes, like for the corporation, profit is the ends. For people, sustenance is the ends. And we have to, it's not that we should be denying a corporation its profits, it's just we have to prioritize. Then he's going to say private ownership of all other property. We are Catholic, so I would agree with him here. Totally we don't totally unvest from the obligation for the government and for the church to recognize private property. But private property is a contingent thing. There is no such thing as private property to the exclusion of the common good. Assuming that all things equal, then the common good is fairly well distributed. Absolutely, people have right to their private property, their homes, their farms, their businesses, which they can then in turn pass on to their children or to a trusted colleague or something of that effect. The abolition of privately owned Federal Reserve Board and the institution of a central government owned bank. All right. 100% behind this. This is where I really had to break originally with the libertarians. The libertarians say they just want to say end the Fed. Okay. And then what happens the next day? What happens after we end the Fed? Oh, just end the Fed. They don't really have an answer for. They just think that things are just going to happen. Like things just happen. Things do just happen, but they don't necessarily happen for the good. Now, me being the Hamiltonian that I am, if we're going to live in a federalist society, federalist government, under a federalist government, I think Hamilton offers the best viability for that set. It's not my ideal form of government, but if we're going to live in a federal structure, Hamilton offers the better way of functioning that form of government than the sort of idealist, almost quasi pre Marxist egalitarianism of Jefferson. Hamilton famously, in his report on public credit and on his report for a central bank, he does three things. He assumes the state debts by the federal government, which sort of obligates the states to then see to it that the federal government survives so that it's able to pay them back what it owes on their debts, on the debts that are owed to the state. Two, he forms the mint, he forms the US currency. And then three, he regulates it and centralizes it under a central bank. And now 20 some, and the central bank basically kickstarted, this is why America became successful. The central bank was dismantled during a sort of blip of Jeffersonianism that arose in the 1820s under President Jackson. And he dismantles, he dissolves the central bank. And so instead of going back to a central bank in 1914, Woodrow Wilson instead opens up this Federal Reserve, which is almost like a private cartel that controls the interest rates of the American economy and the world economy for that matter. It's basically a private cartel of bankers who work in this weird, like public private. And personally, my personal opinion is that this sort of banking class, this banking interest class, and the control that they have over the Federal Reserves, they tend to prioritize the interests of the banks over the interests of the American people. Whereas I think if we had a government bank, a central bank, and you had a government that was in there, granted that's a qualifier, I admit it, but we always want our people in power. That's what power is about. You want your own people in there. If we had a central bank and the people that were in power were our people, that central bank could prioritize the interest of the people over the interest of the bankers. So that's where he's getting at with that. The right of Congress to coin and regulate money. Number 6. So there, it's strictly like a more of a issue that was taking place during the Great Depression. He wants to have a restored, and as it was in the Constitution, the congressional authority over currency. With at the time there was a lot of private control of the money supply, especially through these bankers, and they're toying with the things, creating deflation problems, creating problems where there's a credit shortage because the bankers are looking out for their own interests over and above the interests of the people. So he's saying we want Congress, in the same sense that Congress has the ability to control the central bank, that he's suggesting we also want Congress to be able to control the printing and regulation of the money flow. Control the cost of living and the value of money by the central bank. Control cost of living. So you would give the bank then, the government bank would, in order to, in times of great fluctuation, which we may be facing, we may be facing right now as war looms upon us, you're gonna realize if we end up in a really sticky, nasty war, stabilizing prices and the currency value could be pretty tricky. And if you leave it to the private forces, they're going to be out for their own interests in this moment. So it's not a bad idea to allow Congress to control and stabilize prices and the value of money over, because look, the argument is, oh, you don't want the government doing it, blah blah blah, you want this organization over here doing it, and it's always going to be somebody doing it. And we have a better shot, especially if we have people in Congress who are representative of the people rather than people that are in these private banks that are representative of the interests of the banks, who are setting prices and setting the value of currency. Because what ended up happening in the Great Depression is you had massive deflation. There wasn't enough money in the economy, which then ends up crushing debtors, who are principally the farmers and the homeowners, while this ends up benefiting the creditors when the money supply is crushed like that. Cost of production plus fair profit for the farmer. So this is very much within line with what was going on in the Great Depression. A lot of the farms were hit very hard, and so he's addressing that. Not agriculture, I think, would probably, who knows? I don't keep up with agriculture that much in terms of economics. Agriculture is incredibly important when it comes to economics because that's a huge part of our food supply chain. We would be in some kind of way if the farming was disrupted right now. He wants to have somebody come in and control how much it's costing these farmers to produce, so that you're not doing things like overproducing. You're not doing things like undervaluing your product, and then you end up insolvent. We have the right of laboring men to organize unions and the duty of the government to protect those organizations against the vested interests and wealth and intellect. Oh man, would I have a lot to say about this one. I'd like that in there. A vested interest of wealth and intellect. Because here's the deal. The masses, and this is going back to my Hamiltonian roots, the masses are easily swayed. We love the masses. We want to help the masses. We don't wish and want to inflict harm upon the masses, but the masses can be pretty dumb. There's no other way to say it. And if you've got people who've got a lot of money and they're smarter and they don't have the Christian moral framework, they don't believe in Catholic social teaching, they're ripe to go take advantage of the masses. So we need something with teeth, something with leverage that can step in and protect the masses, sometimes from themselves. And what ends up happening in the 1990s, especially in the 80s and 90s with the rise of Reaganomics, is we have a total and complete outsourcing of American manufacturing. Coughlin here is assuming that we're going to have sort of the continuation of manufacturing as it was in his time, where we were a manufacturing powerhouse. And so he's saying, look, if you got manufacturing, you need to have the ability of labor to unionize, and the government should be there to protect the ability of these people of labor to unionize. And the big problem with that, though, is that once everything is offshored and sent overseas, and then the unions are left there without a factory to unionize around, yeah, then pretty much the interests of wealth and labor, excuse me, wealth and intellect have said, okay, we can't rob you anymore. We can't embezzle, we can't weasel our way out of your money and your what's due to you anymore. So we're just going to take everything overseas, or we're going to flood the country with cheap labor. Recall of all non-productive bonds. This would have been very pertinent for their day. The abolition of tax-exempt bonds, again, very pertinent for the day. I just want to make sure I get through these. Simplification of government and the lightning taxation on the laboring class. So I'm all for doging it. I think doging it is good. We're in a much harder place to do that now. The saying was a decade ago, drain the swamp. That was so vague that it never really got itself off the ground. Oh, you're going to leverage power to drain the people that are in power out of power. That doesn't make any sense. It's the people that would be there to drain the swamp are the people that are in the swamp. So unless you go in, the people do, and you know how the people are, how fickle they are, unless they go in with their pitchforks and torches, it's very hard once a bureaucratic body has been built to simplify it, to try to streamline it. Though in principle, I agree. I agree with the simplification of government. I definitely agree with the lightning taxation on the laboring class. Make it as easy as possible for a middle class to emerge. Make it as easy as possible for families to thrive. That's what we want. That's the goal that we want. That's what America, it should be what sets America apart and makes America a unique and great country. Control the cost of living and the value of money by the central bank. Yeah, that's a reiteration of the point, but I think it's thinking more here now in terms of like cost of living for the average person, just making sure that people can afford the things that they need. They need gas, they need food, they need electricity, all of the things that we need to survive, making sure that people aren't in this like constant state of month to month paychecks and dread, because that does not create a healthy and sustainable society. In the time of war, conscription of wealth as well as of men required drafting. There's no way you're ever going to get around that kind of thing. Now he's writing this pre-World War II and the manslaughter that was, but he is writing it after World War One and the manslaughter that is. And I think in principle it's correct. In times of war, we should be able to conscript men. I guess the main thing he's trying to push here, though, is the idea that we also need to be able to conscript wealth. And you don't want the billionaire class to hoard all of their wealth while we are being sucked dry to pay for the wars that are going on. But that's such a sticky topic right now, given where we're at with the war situation right now. Well, we're never going to pay. Look at the change in the budget of the U.S. government before and after the Iraq War. We're never going to pay that down. We're going to be for as long as this country is a country now, we're going to be trying to get that under control. We never will. That was the Republicans that did that, by the way. The ones who were supposed to be the fiscal ones, the ones that were supposed to be good with money. So and these ones, in principle, I'm fine with them. I'm just thinking about these in terms of like modern America today, because he was writing in a much different time. And the kind of things that we're faced with, he wasn't really considering so much. Human rights to be held above property rights. Government's chief concern should be with the poor. Yeah, 100% fair take on Catholic social teaching right now. Property rights are granted. They're a right because they're granted. They're not inherent. But humans have a sort of intrinsic inherent dignity, and the government's concern should be first and foremost, if we do truly have a housing crisis, it should be not so much with it should be with the housing sector, insofar as the housing sector needs to be corrected so that people have homes. It shouldn't be for the housing sector for the sake of, oh, our profits are getting hit. Yeah, that's his platform. Coughlin was a, let's see, Coughlin was he's a populist. He's corporatist leaning, I would say, definitely anti-elitist. By corporatist leaning, this is one of those ones where it can be vague to say that, but what I mean is he wants to see the efficiency of corporations geared towards the common good rather than geared towards the interests of the few. So economically, the orientation favors organizing society and the economy around these corporations that are like interlinked. They're sort of a webbed network. They're all held together. They hold each other up. They sustain each other. They protect each other. They also rely on each other. If one were to like fall away, the whole web doesn't just collapse, but it's able to sustain while the one's being repaired. It's not all of these like just simply competing interests against one another, working against one another. It's more of a idealized sense of how a society should function. So he's putting this out in the context of the 1930s. He's becoming more and more disillusioned with FDR. FDR hears that Father Coughlin is becoming more and more disillusioned with his policies. And one of the first things he does is he sends his, what would he be called? It's a secretary of the Exchange Committee, which was JFK's dad, Joe Kennedy, and Joe Senior goes and visits Father Coughlin in Detroit and has a little meeting with him. Apparently, they got along; it was kind of cordial. But I think at that point, Coughlin is an idealist. He's an ideologue. He's committed to what he believes is the right thing to do. Kennedy, as we all know, the Kennedys they were way more pragmatic about politics than they were ideologically committed to certain things. So Kennedy's, after a while, is like, I can't really do anything with them. They tried to have the bishops shut them down. Eventually, it does work, but it's not until after the war and it's over the issue of Coughlin speaking about the Jews. It has nothing to do with his criticisms of FDR. He couldn't even get the president. The president couldn't even get Coughlin shut down for his criticisms of the most powerful man in the country. But after World War II, he gets shut down for his what's deemed as his anti-Semitism, though I would take umbrage with how that's being defined. The problem with the anti-Semitism argument is that one people define it one way and another is defining it another way. And if by anti-Semitism you mean that Father Coughlin thought that Jews were racially inferior people who were collectively, this individual Jew right there is collectively guilty for the crimes of other Jews, that's not what Father Coughlin believed. That's what anti-Semitism was supposed to mean. What it became to mean was that you saw specific behaviors or conditions where, for example, Jewish people were overrepresented in the banks, and the banks were causing a problem. So when Father Coughlin was speaking about Jewish influence, he was speaking about it in those terms, in terms of that undue influence. And honestly, it was more about them as bankers than it was strictly them as Jews for Father Coughlin, anyways. And I think that's quite clear if you take the time to listen to his messaging. But anyways, he's breaking ways. He thinks that FDR is making too many concessions to the bankers. It's not that he didn't want to make some concessions to the bankers. It's not that he's a communist. He's not. He's very clearly not a communist, but there's going to be some divergence between him. For example, over economics, the Convergence would be that they're seeking stability and they're trying to curb exploitation, though the differences there would be that Coughlin is looking for a more radical overhaul of the banking institutions, in particular, what would be radical then, it's even still a radical proposal today, though less so, is his call to abolish the Fed. Whereas FDR is more working to look within these systems to try to reform them within. As far as labor wages go, they have a very similar strong emphasis on union rights, on specific labor rights, living wages, reduced hours, worker safety, these kinds of things. Though with Coughlin, it's very clearly within the paradigm of humanity over property rights, the dignity of the human being. Whereas you get the sense with FDR, it's more of a secular humanist project than anything else. I think there's a lot of crossover on them with agriculture. I would say FDR did go pretty, he moved pretty hard to consolidate and national, quote unquote, nationalize certain aspects of agriculture, though I don't think it would have been as much as Father Coughlin would have liked. For the welfare state, I think it's Father Coughlin is willing to go so far as to say if it's an imperative, if the situation is dire, government needs to step in, nationalize if necessary, and conscript wealth if necessary. Where FDR is more focused on trying to come up with these like relief valves that would thwart the need for that, with like Social Security, with these little work project programs that he comes up with. He's trying to. He's not. He knows none of that is going to be like. It's not going to solve the problem, but he's looking for some relief. It's like a relief valve where the problem doesn't like fester to the point that people are rioting in the streets. I'm trying to think if there's really anything else. I think that's about all I would want to say in terms of their crossover and divergence. That kind of covers the gamut of that list that he provides, anyways. The one thing I think that's pretty obvious that comes out of this is you're dealing with a man who's very clearly committed to his Catholic teachings. As I said, he was a Basilian who they took a vested interest in studying medieval usury and studying usury qua usury. And you can see in his platform and in his radio broadcasts, if you take the time to listen to some of them, you can see and you can hear a man that's very concerned with the poor, the needy, and he's willing to say we may need to be a little bit radical if the situation is radical, and if the choice is between bankers losing profits or families starving, then we need to prioritize the families over profits. That's the core of it. I don't think FDR would disagree with that per se, but it was how far are they willing to go to see that through? That was where the divergence was. And look, guys, I'm going to lay my cards out on the table. I am a little bit of a New Dealer myself. I believe that the New Deal was largely the correct way to handle the Great Depression. I do. I think that World War II definitely stimulated the economy. There's no getting around that reality. But the other option, I know there's some revisionists like Amity Schlels that want to revise the way that we're supposed to look at the 1920s and look at what's his name, Coolidge, President Coolidge, and Hoover, and that they were Hoover especially was much more a interventionist than an economic interventionist than he wasn't so laissez-faire. I could probably grant some of that stuff, but if you look, you compare Coughlin to Hoover, and you definitely see a wide divergence because Hoover was very much a part of protecting the interest of the banks and the interest of corporate interests over personal interests in terms of the few over the many. He saw that as the functional way to keep the society rolling, to keep the economy rolling. The economy for Hoover was an ends in itself, which it never was, of course, for Coughlin. I don't think it really was for FDR. So that's what I am. I'm a modern day with the adjustments of we're dealing with. There is no modern day New Deal party. It's not the Democrats. The Democrats are a bunch of sexual degenerates. That's all they are today. And in a way, there was a moment where the Republican Party in the 1960s could have picked up the New Deal. It did in some ways. Nixon attempted it. He attempted to do a moderate New Deal thing, and then Reagan economics came along and it undid all of that. And then you get the whole neocon thing. Trump's populism on paper sounded kind of New Deal-ish, but in reality, it's been something quite different. So we don't actually exist. We're like people out on a life raft. But I only say New Dealer in the sense that what's been granted to us. I'm a political realist. I'm a pragmatist. What are our options? This is the system that we have. We have a federal system. I think Hamiltonian, the structuring federalism around Hamiltonianism is generally speaking the right way to do it, adjusted with some of what we know about the New Deal situation. Assuming under all of this, though, circling all of this is within the paradigm of a Christian society that cares about its citizens above the needs of the few and the rich. That has to be a priori. That has to be before we start talking about, oh, how are we going to be a federalist country, or how are we going to be this or that. It's like we have to have some basic principles. So then further downstream, when we hit these conflicts, it's a time of economic strife. And where do we go here? Who do we prioritize? Like, we need to have that religious foundation first so that we don't even have to question that. Once we get to that moment, those moments come, they always come, economic strife, we know where our principles are. Our principles are with prioritizing the human being first. And I would love to have something like Father Coughlin's political platform as a platform that was a viable political platform of one of the parties in this country. If you could have that platform, granting some of the things that would have to be adjusted for modernity, and not have sexual degeneracy as part of that platform, you would have a winning ticket, bar none, in the United States of America. You can quote me on that. You had somebody come along and they offered that kind of protectionism towards labor, towards its citizenry, as well as granting the banks certain things that the banks need to be functional and operational, giving the banks what they need to do their job without dominating the rest of society. If you were to have that as a political platform, and then you also valued human decency and family and men and women and as the caretakers of children and the context of a home, and you promote churches and moral virtuosity, then I think that we would have a one heck of a political party in the United States of America if we had a party that did all of that. But we have one party that kind of leans towards certain protections for workers, though they seem to be just as much globalist and internationalist as the other one. But they're absolutely degenerates. And then we have another party who they give lip service to some of the social conservatism, but they're hardcore globalists and they prioritize the moneyed interest way above the interest of the people, except for so much as the people give them a vote. And that goes for both sides. So anyways, that's what I have for you guys today. It's been an hour. I hope you enjoy this. It's like I said, it's a Friday riff. I don't think there's anything else I need to let you guys know about that's going on. But yeah, I hope you enjoy it. Hope you enjoy your Friday. God bless you all, and I will see you next time.